Our cities now are in a state of chaos, all because of the phony idea that any law enforcement that has a disparate impact on black criminals is by definition racist law enforcement. The fact of the matter is given the crime disparities in this country, you cannot enforce the law in a colorblind, neutral fashion without having a disparate impact on black criminals. That's not the fault of the law.
How can President Trump tackle America's crime epidemic?
By speaking the truth about crime in the United States. That's his most important power, is the bully pulpit. For years now, our crime-fighting abilities have been destroyed by the myth that any racial disparities in criminal justice are the necessary product of racial discrimination. And that's what's led to prosecutors refusing to prosecute property crime, turnstile jumping, trespass, resisting arrest. It's why a lot of police chiefs are saying don't make quality of life, broken windows type policing for public disorder, because it will have a disparate impact on black criminals. And as a result, our cities now are in a state of chaos, all because of the phony idea that any law enforcement that has a disparate impact on black criminals is by definition racist law enforcement. The fact of the matter is given the crime disparities in this country, you cannot enforce the law in a colorblind, neutral fashion without having a disparate impact on black criminals. That's not the fault of the law. When you stop enforcing the law, you also have a huge disproportionate impact on black victims. The solution is to stop the law breaking from within the family. But in the meantime, we have to get back to a full-throated defense of law and order. And Trump understands this. He understands that cities cannot be allowed to sink into squalor. He cares about public order. He cares about looting. He cares about theft. He cares about graffiti, thank heavens. He has a capacity to do something about it in Washington, D.C. His ability to go into actual day-to-day law enforcement in cities is limited. We have a federal system in this country, and most law enforcement decisions go on at a very local level that the federal government has very little control over. So there are certain things he could do that we can talk about, Stephen, but for me, the main power and accomplishment that he could have is to change the national narrative and say that the police are not racist. We support law enforcement. We will back them when they make arrests of criminals and not call them racists.
You wrote a really interesting article for the New York Post recently about witnessing a crime happening at a local CVS, a sort of pharmacy for people who don't know. And you said there was this very high expectation from one of the CVS workers, or someone there, I can't remember who they were, but they said that Trump, he could solve all of these issues within a matter of weeks. That's not going to happen, obviously. But as you say, the most important aspect of this is on DAs, right? So this is district attorneys. Can you just explain how that system works and why it's broken?
Well, first of all, the article, I was in a local drugstore, and the cashier was not your typical, what the New York Times would think of as your typical MAGA voter. He was Puerto Rican, long hair, long beard, but we all witnessed a huge shoplifting going on. A New York youth, as they say, had been walking through the store with the usual black trash bag, got his heist, and then darted out the store. And these were the workers there. The law-abiding workers are themselves overwhelmingly minority. And what was so striking is the cashier said to me, just out of the blue, well, maybe in another week we won't have to go through with this. This was 2 weeks after or maybe a week after the inauguration. He assumed that I knew what he was talking about, and he was an example of why the working class and minorities, bodega workers, clerks at fast food restaurants, are voting for Trump because they experience the breakdown of law and order in a way that the progressive elites do not. So this guy, this cashier that was just so disheartened by this, but was really putting all of his hopes in that in a week this will have been solved, he's the new voter. District attorneys are the prosecutors who decide, they have the discretion to decide whether to bring a case or not. In big left-wing cities, they are themselves overwhelmingly left-wing, and they are one of the most important tools in this phony conceit that racial disparities are by definition the result of racism. So in New York City, in Los Angeles, in Oakland, California, which is in the suburbs of San Francisco across the East Bay, you've had progressive prosecutors who have not just exercised their discretion on a case-by-case basis, saying, well, you know, this guy just was drunk one night and his first offense and he seems very contrite. I'm not gonna prosecute him. I'm not gonna seek a jail sentence. I'll try and work out some kind of community responsibility. No, what these progressive prosecutors have done have declared across the board entire categories of crime which they weren't going to prosecute because of race. Because if they do prosecute for shoplifting, the guy that was shoplifting in my local CVS drugstore was typically black, and that's the demographic. Sorry, that is the reality. But you've had prosecutors deciding that they would rather not prosecute the law and lock up criminals than prosecute the law in a colorblind fashion and lock up black criminals. And so as a result, I don't know what it's like in Britain, Steve, but it's very hard to shop these days. You go to drugstores and toothpaste is behind bars. We're not going to put the thieves behind bars, but we put toothpaste behind bars. You have to wait around for about 10 minutes for a clerk to come and unlock the plexiglass shield that is covering up the most basic necessities of human life. And guess what happens? People say, to heck with this, I'm going to just order on Amazon. So you're entering a death spiral of the retail sector in the United States now, where rather than and you have what happens as well is stores tell their employees, don't accost somebody who's a shoplifter, don't make an arrest, don't call the police. Why? The usual reason. Because if you do, you will be calling the cops on black criminals, and the civil liberties organizations will come and picket us and say we're racist. This happened to the big chain of department store chain in New York called Macy's, that's a national chain now. And maybe 15 years ago, they were sued by some civil rights group because the people that they detained for shoplifting were disproportionately black. The only allowable explanation in the United States for that disparity is racism, that somehow the overwhelmingly black Macy's clerks were ignoring the hordes of white shoplifters out of racial animus and say, well, we'll let those guys go, and only concentrating their attention on black shoplifters. No, that was not what was happening. The Macy's clerks were seeing who was doing the shoplifting and were making arrests. But that is a truth that has been taboo, and instead we blame every other actor in the system, and that leads to the anarchy and squalor that you're seeing in New York cities now.
Certainly in some parts of London, you do see those locked up, goods in stores, which is incredibly depressing. But to UK viewers and to some viewers around the world, they find this system of district attorneys quite bizarre. Basically they just don't understand it. And obviously in the UK, it's totally centralised, and we have, the Met Police, and there's different police forces, but it's set by the state government. In your sort of ideal world, would Trump just scrap this whole system of district attorneys and completely federalise everything, completely centralise everything?
No, because you have to realize that power will change hands, and so everything that a conservative government will do when we think, oh, this is great, these people that share my values, you have to assume that that power will switch hands and precedent will be used in the opposite direction. So it would have been very disturbing if former President Joe Biden, or God forbid, future President Kamala Harris had that power, because the first thing that Biden did when he took office in 2020 was a whole slew of executive orders saying racial equity is going to be the lodestar of every federal government agency, and if he could have done that, he would have done so as well in every local law enforcement. So, there's a benefit of kind of divide and conquer, that you're less likely to make a very widespread collective error that way. Obviously, again, if you could guarantee that your leaders would always be of your own political persuasion, yes, one would like centralized power and diffused federal power, but it's just the consequences are too great when that power changes hands. So I think it's a good thing to have what, we talk about the laboratory of democracy, where you can actually have the federalism provides real world experiments in which kind of policies work best. And now you have a big boasting and crowing and vaunting going on in the United States by conservative organizations who claim that there's a lot of demographic movement into Republican conservative red states because of their economic policies, because of their law enforcement. And this is seen as a real repudiation of democratic, criminal-friendly, anti-bourgeois order policies. So it's good to have that opportunity for real life, shoulder by shoulder experiments in what types of public policy work and don't work.
Of course, the federal government does have some power over crime across the entire country through the FBI. And I'm reading this really interesting book about J. Edgar Hoover and the kind of expansion and the beginning of the FBI in the 1920s and beyond. And it says basically that the FBI's powers to go after criminals across the United States expanded throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and so on, when local state police departments essentially weren't doing their jobs. So Congress legislated, particularly on issues like civil rights, where they started to instigate, anti-lynching policies and so on, where the FBI went in and basically tackled an issue that local state, local police departments weren't dealing with. Is there an argument that Trump should expand the power of the FBI, should expand the power of sort of federal law enforcement, when local state or local DAs are not doing their jobs, are not prosecuting people?
Yeah, that's a very interesting argument, Stephen. And in fact, in his campaign materials, Trump had put forward the idea of at least investigating local district attorneys who engage in race-based policies. That is, not prosecuting whole categories of crime because they didn't want to increase the racial incarceration gap. And I asked around various conservative district attorneys. There are a bunch in California, believe it or not. And do they think this would be a good idea to have the federal government investigate and presumably prosecute local prosecutors for not prosecuting the law, especially if they're doing so in the name of protecting blacks? Conceivably, you could make some constitutional arguments there that is a violation of civil rights. It's very complicated to figure out what the litigation posture would be. But curiously, most of the conservative district attorneys who I spoke to, who are completely against shutting down law enforcement in the name of avoiding racial disparities, they did not want the feds to come in. Even against progressive prosecutors, they thought that the solution was the ballot box. They pointed to the fact that this last election cycle, there were some left-wing prosecutors who were thrown out, most notably in Los Angeles, the district attorney there, George Gascon, who was one of those prosecutors who on day one upon taking office put out a memo saying we're not going to prosecute these crimes because it'll have a racial disparate impact. the district attorney in Oakland, California, Pamela Price, faced a recall effort that was successful. She was one of the worst. So that's their view. I would say, again, there's no neutral principle that will cover all circumstances. Right now, we think, yes, we've got a conservative White House. Let him go after the race mongers who have decided to make war on hardworking American taxpayers. They have engaged in what I call the great inversion, which is that government no longer thinks of itself as vindicating the rights and the freedoms of the hardworking and the law-abiding. Instead, government thinks that it is the handmaiden of the antisocial, of the criminal element, of the dysfunctional, and views ordinary, hardworking, tax-paying citizens as simply ATMs, as automatic cash machines to fund all of its failed and inevitably failing social uplift programs. So right now we'd like that power to expand, but again, all I can say is, will we want that expanded power? Now, that's not to say that we've got it right. I'm sort of validating the status quo. Who's to say that, what happened in the 20s and 30s with the expansion, and that now we're in a Goldilocks and the Three Bears situation where it's just perfect. Maybe we can play around with it in one direction or the other, but I don't have any kind of crystal ball that would say that a massive expansion of federal power would necessarily be the best thing. We do have, the FBI has these joint task forces. Most famously, there's terrorism task forces where the FBI works with local police departments on trying to use intelligence to get terrorist suspects off the streets. But I can tell you this, Stephen, there's a lot of competition between the FBI and local police. I'll go so far as to say, in some instances, even animosity, where a lot of local police departments kind of have a chip on their shoulder against the FBI. They think that they're kind of these pointy-headed people that don't necessarily have the street smarts that local police officers and police departments have. That's not always the case. There are examples of strong cooperation, especially when it comes down to, the federal agents don't really have the power to go after what I think is the most essential problem in American cities now, which is the petty theft, the disorder, the vagrancy. But the federal government does have jurisdiction over serious violent crimes and gun trafficking, illegal gun use, has a huge jurisdiction over drug trafficking. So, it's not as if the feds have no entry into local street disorder. They do. But as I say, it's a complicated process.
In 2020, there was this BLM moment with George Floyd and everything, and that obviously accelerated much of this far-left rhetoric to do with crime and policing, particularly this defund the police movement, which became very popular for a few months. And this is when they painted over this street in Washington, D.C., this sort of Black Lives Matter Boulevard kind of thing. That was the peak BLM era, I suppose. But it seems now, and maybe you disagree with this, that rhetoric has sort of retreated. You don't hear people talking about defund the police anymore. People like Gavin Newsom, some Democrats are sort of distancing themselves, including Joe Biden, from that rhetoric. What do you think about where that BLM movement is today? I know we also had the Daniel Penny case. Maybe you can talk about that as well. But do you think that kind of anti-cop, anti-police movement is on the retreat?
Well, it's definitely on the retreat. The question is it going to come back? And this is the big question everybody's asking himself in the United States now, assuming that we get 4 years at least out of Trump and his administration. I mean, maybe we'd even get more with J.D. Vance. I don't know. Is that sufficient to rout this whole sickness? This whole race sickness, the anti-white hatred, and the defund rhetoric died down actually long before Trump won the election. And I actually thought that Republicans were a little facile in their attaching onto that one phrase, because in fact there were very few politicians who actually called for defunding the police. And so it was kind of a straw man to go after that. It was more important to go after the idea that, again, that racial disparities are the result inevitably of racism, not of behavioral differences, of racial skills gaps, and a whole set of other factors. So there's been that rhetoric has really kind of disappeared for a while. In the universities, however, you still have presidents sending out messages after the Trump elections saying, well, to their students, it's the usual nauseating safetyist rhetoric about, I know we all feel vulnerable and traumatized at this matter, and please go see your wellness therapist in our massive wellness bureaucracies that we've built, because we're all so mentally ill, and especially us females on college campuses today. But there was also a few messages I sent out saying, well, I know you feel very traumatized if you see a police officer, so please, if you do, be perfectly willing to call the campus police, because they're not as racist as the city police officers. So we still have this conceit that somehow the police are the biggest threat to minority lives, which is a complete fallacy. There's no government agency more dedicated to black lives than the police, and when the police pull back, as I said earlier, it's black lives that get taken. Another 2,000 in 2000 alone. Black lives were murdered. I mean, the numbers of homicides in the United States are just mind-boggling, and put into European perspective, you know, between 16 and 20,000 a year. Dozens of blacks are mowed down every single day in fatal drive-by shootings. You know, this is just, in Japan, I think there's a dozen homicides a year, so it's really quite a unique situation we have here. But we'll see. You know, right now, the Democrats are kind of looking around and seeing what they can keep in their old world view and what they have to, with great sorrow, throw overboard. And we'll see what happens. The criminology profession in the United States, in academia, is unremittingly left-wing. They're criminologists, but they're really anti-police activists. So that's still going to be around. I don't know. 4 years is a very long time. I'm, for the first time in my life, strangely, bizarrely optimistic. I've never been this way, but I actually could imagine that 4 years of our main leader saying, I'm not going along with the race hustle any longer. You can't scare me by calling me a racist. Maybe after 4 years, nobody else will be willing to take up that yoke any longer. That's my hope.
Yeah, it's interesting. One last question. I want to ask about New York City. That's where you're based, right? I think you might even be there now. It's fascinating. Across the world, when you look at crime, it's committed by a very, very small number of people, but it has obviously massive impact on everyone. And if you looked at El Salvador, for example, where they've locked up, I don't know how many tens of thousands of criminals, but that basically, massively collapsed the number of crimes being committed in that country, made it very, very safe. In Britain, we've recently had data coming out on migrant crime. 1/4 of all convictions and arrests have basically been committed by foreigners in Britain in the last few years. Anyway, in New York City, you've got Eric Adams, who's the mayor. Can you just update us as to what's going on with that? Because that's such an odd situation where he's a Democrat, he's a former police officer, but he's going on Tucker Carlson now, and he seems to have become more conservative. But then I guess you have the district attorney who's more on the left. So what's going on with New York City?
Well, first of all, I just want to say, backtrack a little bit. We have these, New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco are what we call sanctuary cities, where they the officials refuse to cooperate with federal immigration authorities. So, and typically the situation is the federal immigration agents, the acronym is ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, will get wind of the fact that an illegal alien has been in a state prison or a local jail. And again, here's the federalism problem. And will ask the authorities in that local jail, which is the city facilities, and it tends to be shorter term sentences, or in a state prison, which are states and longer sentences for felonies. Please let us know when that illegal alien criminal is going to be released so that we can just come and pick him up, take him off your hands, and get him out of the country. It's not as if we have enough law-abiding illegal aliens. We need to keep the criminals as well. And so these sanctuary cities say, sorry, we're not going to tell you when we're releasing this illegal alien criminal. We want our illegal alien criminals to stay in New York, to stay in Chicago, to stay in Los Angeles, to stay in San Francisco. It's astounding. You would think that every police chief would say, take him off my hands. I don't care if the illegal alien criminal is maybe 10% or 20% of our crime problem. I'm happy to get rid of 10 or 20%. I'm better off without that 10 or 20%. Instead, they'll, like, in the dark of the night, they'll release the illegal alien criminal. Get out, ICE is coming, get out of here. It's just astounding how committed the left is to keeping the third world in the United States. Now, with Eric Adams, he's been a very weird mayor. I was not in favor of him to begin with, and he's been a very mediocre mayor. He has not had the fire, the zeal of reform, of understanding the principles of bourgeois order that the late lamented Rudolph Giuliani had. And he's late lamented because he's a shadow of his former self, but as mayor, he was one of the great mayors in this American history. So Adams is sort of, sometimes he plays the race card, sometimes he doesn't. And so I can't really figure out what's going on with him and Trump and pardoning. I think Trump is getting too involved. I don't like the involvement of Trump in local prosecutions. Again, it looks like it's an abuse of power. But Adams, he's facing a lot of challenge from his left. It'll be, again, very interesting to see how strong the left is still in cities and urban areas. It'll gets back to your question: is defund the police, or the whole animosity against the police going to resurface? He's facing a challenge from the former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, who was just an absolute impossible to take during COVID. He would have these daily press conferences that were so narcissistic and self-serving, and he put out these utterly arbitrary social distancing rules. But he seems to be kind of adopting the law and order mantle now. So Adams must feel kind of between two pincers and not quite certain how to save his political career at this point.
All right, Heather MacDonald, thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen.